Have you ever noticed that the longest conversation you have every single day isn't with another person? It's with yourself. From the moment you wake up in the morning until the moment your head finally rests on the pillow at night, there's a voice quietly narrating your life. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it shouts, sometimes it encourages you, but sometimes it tells you stories that aren't true. I'll never change. I'm too old now. I've missed my chance. I'm not enough. Nobody really needs me anymore. God couldn't possibly use someone like me. The strange thing is, after hearing those thoughts enough times, we stop questioning them. We stop asking whether they're true. We simply accept them as reality. And that may be one of the greatest battles we fight. Not the circumstances around us, but the thoughts quietly shaping the way we see ourselves. At 60 years old, one thing I've learned is this: not every thought that enters your mind deserves a place in your heart. I wish someone had told me that when I was younger, because there were years when I believed things about myself that God had never said. Years when I let fear speak louder than faith. Years when I mistook my own inner voice for the truth. And if I'm honest, sometimes I still have to remind myself of that. Today, I want to share something that completely changed the way I think about my own thoughts. But before we get there, I need to ask you something. Who is teaching you how to see yourself? Because whether we realize it or not, every one of us is listening to someone. Sometimes it's our parents. Sometimes it's our past. Sometimes it's our failures. Sometimes it's our fears. And sometimes it's a voice we've carried around for so long that we don't even recognize it anymore. The Bible tells a fascinating story that begins with a man hiding, not because someone was chasing him, but because of what he believed about himself. His name was Gideon. When we first meet him, he isn't standing confidently before an army. He's hiding while threshing wheat, trying not to be noticed. And then something remarkable happens. An angel appears. But instead of calling Gideon what he felt like, he called him what God saw. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Can you imagine hearing that? A man hiding in fear, being called a mighty warrior. If I had been Gideon, I probably would have looked over my shoulder to see who the angel was talking to, because Gideon certainly didn't see himself that way. His response wasn't confidence, it was doubt. "My clan is the weakest. I am the least in my family." Listen carefully to those words, not because they're unique to Gideon, because they're painfully familiar to us. I'm too weak. I'm too old. I'm not qualified. I'm just... Have you noticed how often we finish that sentence? I'm just a widow. I'm just retired. I'm just an ordinary person. I'm just trying to get through another day. The word "just" has a way of shrinking us. It quietly convinces us that our lives are smaller than they really are. But here's something I've come to believe. God rarely begins by changing our circumstances. He often begins by changing the story we're telling ourselves. Because if Gideon continued believing he was nothing, no miracle would ever be enough. His greatest obstacle wasn't the Midianites. It was the image he carried of himself. And I wonder how many of us are fighting the same battle today. Not against armies, against beliefs. Beliefs we've repeated so many times that they've become part of our identity. I've always been anxious. I've never been good enough. Nothing good ever happens to me. My best years are behind me. Friend, those may be your thoughts, but that doesn't automatically make them the truth. Now, let me tell you about another man. This one wasn't hiding. He was running. Elijah had just experienced one of the greatest miracles recorded in Scripture. Fire had fallen from heaven. God had answered in spectacular fashion. If anyone should have felt courageous, it was Elijah. But only a short time later, he ran into the wilderness. He sat beneath a tree, and he prayed something heartbreaking. "Lord, take my life." How does someone go from witnessing a miracle to wanting to give up? I've wondered about that many times, and I think the answer begins inside the mind. Because listen to what Elijah says next. "I am the only one left." He believed he was completely alone, but he wasn't. God later told him there were thousands who had remained faithful. Thousands. Think about that. Elijah's feelings were real, but his conclusion wasn't. And there's an important difference. Our feelings deserve compassion, but they don't always deserve authority. Sometimes our emotions describe what we're experiencing. They don't accurately describe reality. I've learned this the hard way. There were seasons when disappointment became so loud that it sounded like truth. There were days when fear spoke with such confidence that I almost believed it. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've whispered, "I'll never recover. My family will never heal. I'll always feel this way." If so, please hear this. Don't believe everything your fear tells you. Fear is a terrible prophet. It predicts futures that never happen. It convinces us we're abandoned when we're actually being held. It tells us God is absent when He may be working in ways we cannot yet see. That's why I love what God does next. He doesn't shame Elijah. He doesn't lecture him. He lets him rest. He gives him food. He gives him water. Only then does he begin to gently reshape Elijah's perspective. I find that beautiful, because God doesn't only care about correcting our thoughts. He cares about caring for the person who is thinking them. Sometimes we're spiritually discouraged because we're emotionally exhausted. Sometimes we've been carrying too much for too long. Sometimes we've forgotten that we're human, and God knows that. Before we continue, if these conversations help you see life through a different perspective, I'd really appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every week, we explore life's deepest questions through faith, experience, and biblical wisdom. Now, let me show you the moment that changed everything for me. Because there is one passage in the Bible that completely transformed the way I think about the conversations happening inside my own mind. And once I understood it, I realized that the greatest battle wasn't outside me. It had been quietly taking place within me all along. Now let me show you the passage that changed the way I think about my own mind. It's found in Philippians chapter 4. But before we read the verse, we need to remember who wrote it. Paul. And where did he write it? Not from a peaceful home, not from a quiet garden, not from a comfortable life. He wrote those words from prison. Think about that for a moment. If anyone had a reason to let discouragement take over his thoughts, it was Paul. He had been beaten, imprisoned, rejected, misunderstood, separated from people he loved. And yet, in the middle of those circumstances, he writes something remarkable. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Notice what Paul doesn't say. He doesn't say, pretend everything is fine. He doesn't say, ignore your problems. He doesn't say, never feel afraid. Instead, he invites us to become intentional about what we allow to remain in our minds. At 60 years old, I've learned something I wish I had understood much earlier. A thought knocking at your door doesn't have to become a permanent guest. Some thoughts arrive without invitation. Fear, shame, regret, self-doubt, old memories. Those thoughts may appear suddenly. But we still have a choice. Do we invite them to stay? Or do we compare them with the truth God has spoken? That question has changed my life more than once, because I realized something. Most of my suffering wasn't coming from what happened. It was coming from the story I kept repeating about what happened. There's a difference. One is a fact. The other is an interpretation. And interpretations can change. King David understood this better than almost anyone. One of my favorite moments in Scripture is found in Psalm 42. David writes something that almost sounds strange the first time you read it. He asks himself, "Why, my soul, are you downcast?" Think about that. He's talking to himself. Then he says, "Put your hope in God." I've always loved that passage because David doesn't simply listen to his thoughts. He responds to them. He challenges them. He redirects them. Life has taught me that there are days when you must become wiser than your own emotions. Not because your emotions are bad. They're not. God gave them to us. But emotions make wonderful indicators. They make terrible leaders. If they lead every decision, our lives become unstable. David acknowledged what he felt. Then he reminded himself of what he knew. And those are not always the same thing. I wonder how many mornings would look different if, instead of believing every thought that entered our minds, we gently asked, "Is that actually true?" Not, "Do I feel it?" but, "Is it true?" Because feelings change. Truth doesn't. That reminds me of another story. When Moses sent 12 men to explore the Promised Land, they all saw the same place, the same cities, the same giants, the same opportunities, the same God. Yet they came back with completely different conclusions. 10 said, "We look like grasshoppers." 2 said, "The Lord is with us." The land hadn't changed. The giants hadn't changed. What changed was the story they told themselves. I've often wondered how many opportunities we quietly walk away from because we've already convinced ourselves we're not capable. Not because God said no, because fear spoke first, and we believed it. Maybe you've done that. I know I have. There were doors I never knocked on because I had already imagined the answer. There were dreams I almost abandoned before God ever asked me to. There were seasons where I assumed God had finished writing my story, when He had only turned the page. One thing life keeps teaching me is this: the voice you listen to the most will eventually shape the life you live. That's why prayer has become so important to me over the years. And here's something I didn't understand when I was younger. I used to think prayer was mostly about asking God to change my circumstances. Now, I think one of prayer's greatest miracles is that it changes the person who walks back into those circumstances. Prayer slows us down. It reminds us who God is. It reminds us who we are. It gently untangles thoughts that have become twisted by fear. Sometimes I finish praying and nothing around me has changed. The same house, the same problem, the same unanswered question. But something inside me has become quieter. Not because I finally found all the answers, but because I've remembered who is walking with me. And that changes everything. The older I get, the more I realize that peace isn't the absence of difficult thoughts. Peace is knowing which thoughts deserve your trust. Friend, maybe today you've been believing something that God has never said. Maybe you've believed you're too old, too broken, too forgotten, too ordinary, too late. Maybe you've quietly accepted those thoughts as facts simply because they've been repeating themselves for years. But repetition does not create truth. Only God does. and his voice has always been different from fear. Fear says, "You're alone." God says, "I am with you." Fear says, "It's too late." God says, "I am making all things new." Fear says, "You've failed too many times." God says, "My grace is sufficient for you." Fear says, "You'll never change." God says, "I who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion." Can you see the difference? One voice pushes you toward despair. The other gently calls you toward hope. One shrinks your world. The other reminds you that your story is still unfolding. So the next time a thought quietly enters your mind, don't ask only, "How do I feel?" Ask, "Who told me this?" And then ask an even better question. What has God said? Because that answer has the power to change everything. Before we finish, I'd love to hear from you. What is one thought you've had to stop believing about yourself? Share it in the comments. Not because you're alone in that struggle, but because someone else reading your words may realize they're not alone either. And if today you've discovered that you've been believing a story God never wrote, remember this. You cannot always choose the first thought that enters your mind, but you can choose which thoughts you invite to stay. Those quiet conversations inside your heart are shaping the person you're becoming. So let God's voice become louder than your fear, because the thoughts that quietly shape your life should never be louder than the God who lovingly shapes your heart. Walk with God.